Long before the first written histories of Greece or Egypt, long before memory hardened into myth, there was said to be a great island beyond the known world. It lay past the pillars of Heracles, beyond the narrow strait that later ages would call Gibraltar, and it was known as Atlantis. According to the story, Atlantis was not merely a place, but a civilization at the height of human achievement, wealthy, powerful, orderly, and deeply connected to the rhythms of nature and the sea. Its memory would survive only in fragments, preserved through oral tradition and later recorded by philosophers who themselves lived centuries after its supposed fall. The story of Atlantis comes to us primarily through the writings of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. He introduced the tale in two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, written around the 4th century before the Common Era. Plato did not present Atlantis as a fable or a metaphor, but as a historical account passed down through generations. He attributed the story to Solon, an Athenian statesman and poet who lived 2 centuries before him. Solon, according to Plato, learned of Atlantis while traveling in Egypt, where priests told him of a forgotten age when powerful civilizations rose and fell long before the earliest Greek records. In the Egyptian city of Sais, priests spoke of a time 9,000 years before Solon's visit, when Athens itself had been a noble and virtuous society. In those distant days, Atlantis ruled much of the known world from its island stronghold in the Atlantic Ocean. It was larger than Libya and Asia combined, as they were understood at the time, and it controlled many other islands as well as parts of the surrounding continents. Its power extended across the sea and into the Mediterranean, bringing both prosperity and fear. Atlantis was said to be a land shaped by divine influence. The god Poseidon, ruler of the seas, fell in love with a mortal woman named Cleito. To protect her, he created the island's distinctive geography, carving rings of land and water around a central hill where she lived. These concentric circles formed natural harbors and defenses, making Atlantis both beautiful and nearly impregnable. Poseidon fathered 10 sons with Cleito, and he divided the island among them, making the eldest, Atlas, the supreme king. From his name, Atlantis and the Atlantic Ocean were said to derive their own. The Atlanteans inherited a rich and fertile land. Their plains were vast and perfectly aligned, irrigated by a complex system of canals that brought water from the mountains to the fields. Crops grew in abundance, and the land yielded precious metals, including one called orichalcum, which shone like fire and was valued almost as highly as gold. Their cities were adorned with temples, palaces, and walls covered in gleaming metals, reflecting sunlight across the water-filled rings. At the heart of Atlantis stood the Temple of Poseidon, a grand structure built of white, black, and red stone. Inside stood colossal statues of the god himself, standing in a chariot drawn by winged horses, surrounded by 100 sea nymphs. The temple was not only a religious center, but a symbol of Atlantean identity, uniting their spiritual beliefs with their political power. Festivals and rituals were held there, reinforcing the bond between the rulers and the divine forces they believed guided their fate. For a long time, Atlantis was governed with wisdom and restraint. The descendants of Poseidon were said to possess a divine nature that kept greed and cruelty in check. Laws were just, and the people lived in harmony with their environment. Wealth was abundant, but it was not yet corrosive. The Atlanteans valued balance, honoring both their mortal limitations and their divine heritage. Over time, however, the divine element within them began to fade. As generations passed, the blood of the gods diluted and human desires grew stronger. Pride replaced humility, and the pursuit of power eclipsed the pursuit of virtue. Atlantis became increasingly ambitious, seeking to dominate not just nearby lands, but the entire Mediterranean world. Its armies grew vast, its fleets unmatched, and its rulers began to believe themselves invincible. It was at this moment, according to the tale, that Atlantis came into conflict with ancient Athens. While Atlantis represented wealth, power, and imperial ambition, Athens stood for discipline, moderation, and moral strength. The Athenians, though fewer in number, resisted the Atlantean advance and ultimately defeated them, pushing back against what Plato framed as a corrupt and overreaching empire. This victory was short-lived, not because of defeat in war, but because of a far greater catastrophe. The downfall of Atlantis came swiftly and completely. In a single day and night of terrible earthquakes and floods, the island was shattered. The sea swallowed the land, and Atlantis vanished beneath the waves. Its harbors collapsed, its temples sank, and its people were lost to history. Where a great civilization once stood, there remained only impassable mud, making the ocean beyond the pillars of Heracles difficult to navigate. Plato ended his account abruptly, leaving many details unfinished. Whether this was intentional or simply the result of an incomplete work is unknown. What remained was a haunting image of a golden age destroyed by moral decay and natural disaster, a warning preserved in philosophy rather than stone. From that moment on, Atlantis became more than a place. It became an idea, a symbol of lost knowledge, fallen greatness, and the fragile line between human achievement and human excess. As centuries passed, the story of Atlantis drifted through Western thought, sometimes taken as allegory, sometimes as history. Ancient writers after Plato rarely expanded on the tale, and some treated it with skepticism. Aristotle, Plato's own student, reportedly dismissed it outright, suggesting that his teacher invented the island as a philosophical device. Yet the story endured, precisely because it felt incomplete, hovering between myth and memory. In later ages, as exploration expanded the known world, Atlantis took on new meanings. Medieval scholars connected it to biblical floods, while Renaissance thinkers revisited Plato's texts with renewed curiosity. The discovery of the Americas added fresh fuel to speculation, as vast lands beyond the Atlantic suddenly became real rather than imagined. Some wondered if Plato's account had been a distorted memory of these distant continents, filtered through time and misunderstanding. By the modern era, Atlantis had become a canvas onto which each generation projected its hopes and fears. For some, it represented advanced lost technology. For others, it was a spiritual civilization that fell from grace. Scientists, mystics, and adventurers alike searched for its remnants, from the depths of the Atlantic to the sands of the Sahara. Yet no definitive proof ever emerged, leaving Atlantis suspended between belief and doubt. What has given the story its enduring power is not certainty, but resonance. Atlantis speaks to the rise and fall of civilizations, to the idea that no society, no matter how advanced, is immune to collapse. It reflects humanity's fascination with origins and endings, with the possibility that the world once held wonders, now erased by time. Whether Atlantis existed as Plato described it or not, its story continues to flow through history like a submerged current, shaping imaginations and reminding us of how easily greatness can slip beneath the surface of memory. In the centuries that followed Plato, Atlantis slowly detached from its original philosophical setting and began to live a life of its own. The absence of concrete evidence allowed imagination to fill the gaps, and with each retelling, the island seemed to drift further away from the careful structure Plato had given it. What remained constant was the sense of loss, the feeling that something vast and meaningful had vanished before it could be fully understood. This sense would become the emotional core of the Atlantis story, drawing people back to it again and again. During the Hellenistic and Roman periods, writers occasionally mentioned Atlantis, but rarely added new details. The focus of intellectual life had shifted toward empire, law, and theology, and Plato's cautionary tale became a quiet echo rather than a central concern. Still, the idea of a great flood and a drowned land found parallels in many cultures. Stories from Mesopotamia, India, and the Hebrew tradition spoke of divine punishment delivered through water. These similarities encouraged later thinkers to wonder whether Atlantis was part of a shared human memory of ancient catastrophes. As Europe entered the Middle Ages, classical texts were preserved largely through monasteries and the Islamic world. Plato's works survived, but they were often read through a religious lens. Atlantis became associated with moral decline and divine judgment, fitting neatly into a worldview shaped by sin and redemption. Some scholars suggested that Atlantis was a poetic way of describing the fall of humanity itself, a reminder that pride inevitably invites destruction. It was not until the Renaissance that Atlantis truly resurfaced as a subject of fascination. As ancient texts were rediscovered and translated, Plato's dialogues regained their influence. At the same time, European explorers were crossing oceans and encountering lands unknown to classical authors. The world suddenly seemed larger, stranger, and more mysterious than previously imagined. In this atmosphere, Atlantis no longer felt impossible. It felt merely lost. Thinkers began to speculate more boldly. Some proposed that Atlantis had been located in the Atlantic Ocean, as Plato described, while others placed it in the Mediterranean, near Crete or Santorini. A few even suggested it lay beneath the Americas, arguing that ancient knowledge of the New World had been forgotten and later mythologized. Each theory reflected the knowledge and assumptions of its time, revealing as much about the searchers as about the island they sought. If you are finding this journey through ancient memory and myth engaging, you might take a moment to like the video or subscribe to the channel, so these long-form stories can continue to unfold for you and others. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Atlantis had become entwined with emerging ideas about human progress. As archaeology uncovered ancient cities and geology revealed the immense age of the Earth, it became clear that entire cultures could rise, flourish, and disappear without leaving obvious traces. This realization made the idea of Atlantis feel less like fantasy and more like a possibility waiting to be confirmed. Lost cities such as Troy, once dismissed as legend, had proven to be real. Atlantis, some believed, might be next. One of the most influential modern revivals of Atlantis came in the late 19th century with the publication of a book by Ignatius Donnelly. He argued that Atlantis was a real prehistoric civilization that served as the source of many ancient cultures. According to Donnelly, the Atlanteans spread knowledge of agriculture, writing, and architecture across the world before their homeland was destroyed. While his ideas were rejected by mainstream scholars, they captured the public imagination and firmly planted Atlantis in popular culture. From that point onward, Atlantis became a fixture in novels, films, and speculative theories. It was portrayed as a land of crystal energy, advanced machines, and enlightened beings. These versions often departed entirely from Plato's account, transforming Atlantis into a symbol of lost perfection or forbidden knowledge. Yet even in these modern retellings, the central theme remained the same. A great civilization rose too high, forgot its limits, and was erased. Behind all these interpretations lies a deeper human question. What do we lose when time moves forward? What knowledge slips away when records fade and languages die? Atlantis represents the fear that the past holds answers we can no longer access, and the hope that somewhere beneath the surface, traces of those answers might still remain. In this way, Atlantis is not just a lost island, but a mirror held up to humanity's longing for connection with its own distant beginnings. As the 20th century approached, the search for Atlantis began to shift from philosophy and speculation towards science and geography. Researchers started to examine Plato's descriptions with new tools, comparing them to what was known about earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and ancient sea levels. Rather than asking whether Atlantis existed exactly as described, many began asking whether the story could have been inspired by real events that were later reshaped by memory and storytelling. One of the most enduring scientific theories links Atlantis to the volcanic island of Thera, now known as Santorini. Around the middle of the second millennium before the Common Era, Thera experienced one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in recorded human history. The explosion shattered the island, caused massive tsunamis, and sent ash across much of the eastern Mediterranean. Entire settlements were buried, preserved in a sudden stillness similar to what later happened at Pompeii. This eruption severely weakened the Minoan civilization, which had dominated the Aegean Sea for centuries. The Minoans were advanced sailors, builders, and traders, living on islands and coastal cities connected by the sea. Their society relied heavily on maritime power, much like Plato's Atlantis. When the eruption struck, it disrupted trade routes, destroyed fleets, and destabilized the political order. Within generations, the Minoans faded from prominence, leaving behind ruins and unanswered questions. Supporters of the Santorini theory suggest that stories of this catastrophe could have traveled through generations, gradually growing in scale and symbolism. Over centuries, a powerful island society destroyed by natural forces might have become, in memory, a vast empire swallowed by the ocean. By the time the story reached Plato, it may have been transformed into a moral and philosophical narrative shaped by Greek values and concerns. Other researchers have looked beyond the Mediterranean to the Atlantic itself. Some have pointed to underwater geological features, such as submerged plateaus and ridges, suggesting they could be remnants of ancient landmasses. However, modern geology has shown that continents do not sink suddenly beneath the sea. Plate tectonics move slowly, over millions of years, making a rapid disappearance like Plato described extremely unlikely on a continental scale. Still, sea levels have changed dramatically over human history. At the end of the last ice age, vast amounts of water were locked in glaciers. As the climate warmed, these glaciers melted, causing sea levels to rise by hundreds of feet. Coastal lands that were once inhabited gradually disappeared beneath the ocean. Entire communities would have been forced to move inland, carrying memories of floods and lost homelands with them. This process likely gave rise to flood myths around the world. From Mesopotamia to the Americas, cultures tell stories of water destroying the old world and giving birth to a new one. Atlantis may be one expression of this shared experience, shaped by Greek philosophy and geography. Rather than a single island sinking overnight, it could represent a collective memory of gradual loss, compressed into a dramatic and unforgettable tale. There are also theories placing Atlantis in unexpected locations. Some have suggested it lay in North Africa, pointing to ancient river systems in the Sahara that once supported lush landscapes. Thousands of years ago, the Sahara was not a desert, but a region of grasslands, lakes, and human settlements. As the climate shifted, these lands dried out, forcing people to migrate and leaving behind stone tools and rock art as silent evidence of what was lost. Others have proposed locations as distant as the Caribbean or Antarctica, often relying on speculative maps or misinterpreted data. While these ideas capture imagination, they tend to drift far from both Plato's account and established science. Yet their persistence highlights something important. The desire to locate Atlantis is not just about geography. It is about grounding myth in reality, about proving that memory and meaning can survive even when physical evidence is scarce. As the century progressed, archaeology continued to uncover real lost cities, from the Indus Valley to the jungles of Central America. Each discovery reinforced the idea that ancient societies could be far more complex and advanced than previously believed. However, none matched the scale or description of Atlantis. The island remained elusive, its absence as powerful as its imagined presence. Gradually, many scholars came to view Atlantis not as a literal place to be found, but as a carefully constructed story with layered purposes. Plato used Atlantis to explore themes of justice, balance, and decline. By contrasting a virtuous ancient Athens with a corrupt and wealthy Atlantis, he illustrated his belief that moral strength mattered more than material power. In this reading, whether Atlantis existed mattered less than what it represented. Yet even this interpretation does not fully close the door. Plato was known to use myths to convey truth, but he also insisted that the story of Atlantis was based on real records. He went to unusual lengths to describe its geography, politics, and downfall in detail. This tension between myth and history is part of what keeps the story alive. It resists a single explanation, inviting each generation to reconsider it anew. In the quiet spaces between fact and imagination, Atlantis continues to drift. It moves through time as both warning and wonder, reminding humanity that knowledge can be lost, landscapes can change, and even the greatest achievements are vulnerable to forces beyond control. Whether it was a real island, a memory of many places, or a philosophical mirror, Atlantis endures because it speaks softly but persistently about impermanence. The sea, which once carried Atlantean ships across imagined waters, now carries the story itself. With each retelling, it erodes certainty but deepens meaning. Atlantis remains submerged not just beneath waves, but beneath layers of human memory, waiting not to be found, but to be remembered in whatever form each listener is ready to receive. As the modern world moved deeper into the 20th century, Atlantis began to take on a quieter but more reflective role in human thought. The rapid advance of technology, the devastation of global wars, and the growing awareness of environmental fragility gave the ancient story new relevance. Atlantis was no longer only a mystery of the past. It became a lens through which people examined their own civilization and its possible future. Scholars increasingly noted how closely Plato's description of Atlantis aligned with a moral cycle. A society begins in balance, guided by respect for nature and shared values. Wealth and power follow. Over time, excess erodes restraint, and ambition overtakes wisdom. Eventually, collapse arrives, not necessarily as punishment, but as consequence. In this way, Atlantis echoed patterns visible throughout recorded history, from ancient empires to modern nations. At the same time, interest in the deep past continued to grow. Advances in oceanography allowed scientists to map the seafloor in unprecedented detail. Submerged coastlines, drowned river valleys, and ancient shorelines were identified around the world. These discoveries confirmed that many areas now underwater were once dry land where humans lived and thrived. While none matched the grandeur of Plato's Atlantis, they proved that the ocean had indeed claimed large portions of humanity's early habitat. One such region lies beneath the North Sea, known today as Doggerland. Thousands of years ago, it connected Britain to mainland Europe and supported human communities. As ice melted and sea levels rose, Doggerland slowly disappeared beneath the waves. People were forced to leave, carrying with them stories of land lost to the sea. For some researchers, this offered a powerful parallel. Atlantis, they suggested, might not be a single sunken island, but an amplified memory of many such losses. This perspective reframed the story once again. Instead of asking where Atlantis was, the question became why humans remember it. Across cultures and continents, stories of floods and vanished worlds appear again and again. They are not always literal records, but emotional truths shaped by fear, grief, and awe. Water in these stories is both destroyer and cleanser, erasing the old and making way for the new. In this sense, Atlantis belongs to a shared human inheritance. It is part of the same narrative tradition that includes the great flood of Mesopotamian epics, the deluge of South Asian texts, and the submerged lands of indigenous oral histories. Each tells of a world that existed before memory hardened into writing, a world closer to nature and perhaps closer to the divine. If you are enjoying this slow journey through myth, memory, and history, you might consider sharing the video or leaving a quiet comment. Small gestures like that help these long-form stories reach others who enjoy thoughtful listening. As the century turned once more, Atlantis found new life in psychology and philosophy. Thinkers began to interpret it as a symbol of the unconscious, a hidden realm beneath the surface of awareness. Just as Atlantis lay submerged beneath the sea, forgotten knowledge and experiences lie beneath conscious thought. In this reading, the search for Atlantis mirrored the search for deeper understanding of the self. Others saw Atlantis as a warning encoded in myth, a civilization that masters technology without mastering restraint risks undoing itself. Plato's Atlantis was technologically impressive for its time, with canals, harbors, and monumental architecture. Yet none of this saved it when balance was lost. For modern listeners, living in an age of immense capability, the story felt uncomfortably familiar. Despite centuries of reinterpretation, Plato's original account continued to anchor the discussion. His Atlantis was not destroyed gradually, but suddenly. A single day and night erased it. This detail has always stood out, suggesting not slow decline but abrupt catastrophe. Earthquakes, floods, and volcanic eruptions are reminders that the Earth itself is active, unpredictable, and indifferent to human ambition. Geological evidence confirms that such sudden disasters have occurred many times in the past. Coastal earthquakes can generate tsunamis capable of wiping out entire regions within hours. Volcanic islands can collapse into the sea, displacing massive volumes of water. While these events may not sink continents, they can destroy civilizations concentrated along coastlines, leaving survivors with memories too large and painful to forget. Over generations, such memories change. Details blur, distances stretch, and time expands. A city becomes a kingdom. A kingdom becomes an empire. An island becomes a continent. What remains constant is the emotional truth. Something precious was lost. Something powerful was humbled. Something beyond human control intervened. Atlantis, then, may be less about a specific place and more about a pattern. It is the story of humanity encountering its limits. No matter how skilled, wealthy, or knowledgeable a society becomes, it remains subject to nature and to its own choices. This realization does not diminish human achievement. Instead, it places it within a larger, humbling context. In quiet moments, the image of Atlantis continues to resonate. Sunlit canals, stone walls gleaming with metal, ships moving effortlessly between rings of water, and then silence, water closing over stone, memory drifting forward, carried not by survivors but by stories. Each generation receives the story slightly altered, shaped by its own concerns, yet still recognizable. Perhaps this is why Atlantis has never truly been found. To find it completely would be to fix it in one time and place, to remove its ambiguity. But Atlantis thrives in uncertainty. It lives in the space between history and imagination, where meaning can shift without disappearing. It is both nowhere and everywhere, a reminder of what once might have been and what still could be lost. As the narration continues, Atlantis remains beneath the surface, not waiting to be raised, but waiting to be understood. Its story flows slowly, like deep water, steady and patient, carrying with it the echoes of ancient shores and the quiet warning that nothing, no matter how magnificent, is permanent. As the story of Atlantis moves further into the present, it becomes clear that its endurance is tied not to proof, but to relevance. Each age reshapes the legend to reflect its own anxieties and aspirations. In earlier centuries, Atlantis symbolized divine punishment and moral decay. In the modern era, it increasingly reflects concerns about environmental collapse, technological overreach, and the fragility of complex systems. The image of a powerful civilization undone by forces it could not control resonates strongly in a world shaped by climate change and rising seas. Coastal cities today face threats not unlike those imagined in Plato's account. Storm surges, earthquakes, and flooding remind humanity that mastery over nature is always temporary. In this context, Atlantis feels less like an ancient myth and more like a quiet premonition. Scientists studying past climate shifts have shown that Earth can change rapidly under certain conditions. Sudden temperature increases, melting ice sheets, and shifting ocean currents have altered coastlines within human timescales. For early societies living close to the sea, these changes would have been catastrophic. Villages and sacred places would vanish, leaving behind only memory and mourning. Over time, such memories could coalesce into stories of entire worlds lost overnight. This understanding adds depth to the Atlantis narrative without stripping it of mystery. The story no longer needs to be literally true to be profoundly meaningful. It becomes a vessel carrying the emotional truth of loss across thousands of years. Atlantis is not remembered because it was perfect, but because it was destroyed. Absence gives it power. In literature and art, Atlantis often appears as a place frozen at the moment before disaster. Paintings depict sunlit towers and calm waters moments before collapse. This focus reveals a human tendency to linger on the threshold between safety and ruin. It is easier to imagine what was lost than to confront the forces that caused the loss. Atlantis allows that contemplation to happen at a safe distance, wrapped in myth. Psychologically, the story also speaks to nostalgia for a perceived golden age. Many cultures imagine a time when life was simpler, more harmonious, and closer to the natural world. Atlantis embodies that longing, even though Plato himself described its corruption. Listeners often remember the beauty and power of Atlantis more vividly than its moral failure. This selective memory mirrors how individuals and societies remember their own pasts. Yet Plato's warning remains embedded in the narrative. Atlantis did not fall because it was weak, but because it forgot restraint. Its people believed their success insulated them from consequence. This detail is subtle but essential. The disaster is not random. It arrives when balance is lost. Whether interpreted literally or symbolically, this pattern repeats throughout history. In the absence of physical ruins, Atlantis exists primarily through language. Words shape its form, its scale, its meaning. Each retelling smooths some edges and sharpens others. The island becomes larger or smaller, more spiritual or more technological, depending on the storyteller. But the core remains intact. A great society rose, it fell, the sea closed over it. This reliance on language connects Atlantis to oral tradition, where stories are living things rather than fixed records. Oral histories adapt to remain relevant, preserving meaning even as details change. In this way, Atlantis may be closer to truth than many written histories. It survives because it can change without losing its essence. Modern archaeology, for all its precision, cannot fully replace this kind of truth. It uncovers stones, bones, and tools, but not the inner experience of loss. Atlantis fills that gap. It gives shape to emotions that leave no physical trace. Fear of oblivion, awe at nature's power, regret over choices made too late. When people search for Atlantis today, they often do so with technology far beyond anything Plato could have imagined. Satellites scan the ocean floor. Sonar maps submerged landscapes. Yet even if a structure were found that matched part of the description, the mystery would not end. Interpretation would take over, and debate would continue. Atlantis would shift again, from myth to anomaly, from certainty back to question. This endless deferral may be the point. Atlantis teaches patience. It resists closure. In a world that seeks quick answers and definitive conclusions, the story remains unresolved. It invites contemplation rather than resolution, listening rather than proving. As time passes, the sea continues its slow work. Coastlines change. Islands erode. What is solid today may be submerged tomorrow. Humanity builds, remembers, forgets, and builds again. Through it all, Atlantis drifts quietly beneath awareness, a reminder that permanence is an illusion and memory is fragile. The story does not demand belief. It asks only to be carried forward. In doing so, it becomes part of a much older conversation between humanity and the unknown. A conversation spoken softly, across generations, like waves moving steadily toward a shore that is never quite the same. As the narrative of Atlantis continues to unfold through time, it begins to feel less like a destination and more like a current. It carries fragments of human experience forward, reshaping them gently as centuries pass. What survives is not architecture or metal, but meaning. Atlantis becomes a shared symbol through which people explore ideas of loss, responsibility, and humility. In many ways, the persistence of the Atlantis story reveals how deeply humans are affected by disappearance. Ruins can be studied, measured, and dated, but what vanishes entirely leaves a different kind of mark. It invites imagination to step in where evidence cannot. Atlantis occupies that space completely. It is defined by what cannot be seen, touched, or confirmed, and yet it feels vividly present. This presence is especially strong in moments when humanity faces uncertainty. During periods of rapid change, people often look backward, searching for lessons hidden in ancient stories. Atlantis offers one such lesson without prescribing a single interpretation. It does not insist on belief, only reflection. It allows listeners to consider what might happen when knowledge outpaces wisdom, or when abundance dulls awareness. If this slow unfolding of the Atlantis story has been meaningful for you, you might consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. It helps keep these long, reflective journeys available for those who enjoy listening deeply. As technology advanced into the digital age, Atlantis found yet another form of expression. It entered virtual worlds, documentaries, and speculative reconstructions, rendered in glowing detail. These modern visions often emphasize symmetry, harmony, and advanced design, echoing Plato's descriptions while adding contemporary aesthetics. In doing so, they reveal as much about modern ideals as ancient ones. Yet even in these detailed reconstructions, Atlantis remains incomplete. There is always something missing, a final confirmation, a single artifact. This absence keeps the story open. It prevents Atlantis from becoming static. Instead, it remains fluid, adapting to new knowledge and new concerns without ever settling into certainty. Some scholars have suggested that Atlantis functions as a kind of cultural memory palace, a place where ideas about governance, ethics, and civilization can be explored safely at a distance. By placing these ideas in a lost world, Plato created room for critique without direct confrontation. Listeners could reflect on their own societies through the lens of a vanished one. This distance also softens the story, making it suitable for contemplation rather than urgency. Atlantis does not shout. It does not accuse. It simply disappeared. The quietness of its ending is part of its power. No survivors are described. No rebuilding follows. The sea closes and the story moves on. In sleep-friendly listening, this quality becomes especially noticeable. The steady rhythm of the narrative mirrors the movement of water, rise and fall, creation and erasure. There is comfort in this pattern, even when the subject is loss. It suggests continuity. Something ends, but something else continues. Perhaps that is why Atlantis has endured where so many other myths have faded. It does not rely on heroes or battles. Its drama lies in imbalance and consequence. These are universal experiences, not tied to a specific culture or era. Anyone at any time can recognize them. As generations pass, the details of Atlantis may continue to shift. New theories will arise. Old ones will fall away. But the core image will remain, an island beyond the horizon. A civilization at its height, a sudden silence. This image does not demand resolution. It invites stillness. In the end, Atlantis may be less about what was lost and more about what remains. The capacity to remember, the willingness to listen, the humility to accept that not everything can be recovered or explained. Some stories are meant to be carried, not completed. So Atlantis drifts on, not as a destination to be reached, but as a companion to human thought. It moves alongside history, philosophy, and imagination, whispering gently about balance, change, and the deep waters of time. And as long as people continue to listen, the story will never truly sink. With each retelling, Atlantis becomes quieter, less a spectacle and more a presence. It settles into the background of human thought like a distant horizon, always there, never fully reached. This quiet persistence is what allows the story to endure without exhausting itself. It does not depend on surprise or revelation. It relies on familiarity, on the slow deepening of meaning over time. In the oldest version of the story, Atlantis was remembered through voices rather than texts. Before Plato wrote it down, it passed from priest to traveler, from generation to generation, shaped by memory rather than ink. Oral tradition does not preserve exact detail. It preserves significance. What mattered was not the precise size of the island or the number of its ships, but the fact that it had existed, flourished, and vanished. This method of preservation aligns Atlantis with the earliest human stories, those told around fires and along shorelines. These stories often explain the world not through measurement, but through pattern. The sun rises and sets, rivers flood and recede, civilizations grow and fall. Atlantis fits naturally into this rhythm, reinforcing a sense that history itself moves in cycles. Over time, the ocean became the defining boundary of the story. The sea is both connector and separator, carrying people and ideas while also erasing what falls into it. In Atlantis, the sea becomes the final keeper of memory. It does not return what it takes. It smooths edges, breaks structures apart, and hides them beneath layers of sand and time. This finality gives the story its emotional weight. For listeners, the sea also represents distance from certainty. Land can be walked, mapped, and claimed. Water resists these impulses. It shifts constantly, reflecting light and shadow, offering no fixed reference. By placing Atlantis beyond the sea, the story places it beyond easy access. It must be approached slowly, imaginatively, rather than conquered. This distance has protected Atlantis from being exhausted by explanation. Many ancient stories lose power once their origins are fully understood. Atlantis remains potent because it cannot be pinned down. Each explanation accounts for part of it, but never all. Geological theories explain catastrophe, historical theories explain memory, philosophical readings explain meaning, none cancel the others out. In this layered quality, Atlantis mirrors human identity itself. People are not defined by a single story, but by many overlapping ones. Memory, environment, choice, and chance all play a role. Atlantis becomes a kind of collective self-portrait, reflecting humanity's awareness of both its potential and its vulnerability. There is also a quiet grief embedded in the story. Not dramatic mourning, but a subdued sadness for what might have been. Atlantis is remembered not because it was evil, but because it was magnificent. Its loss feels unnecessary, even if inevitable. This feeling resonates with anyone who has watched something beautiful fade through neglect, arrogance, or simple misfortune. Plato's version ends without redemption. There is no rebirth of Atlantis, no hidden survivors rebuilding elsewhere. The story closes, and the sea remains. This lack of resolution distinguishes Atlantis from many other myths, where destruction is followed by renewal. Here, loss is final, memory is all that survives, and yet memory is enough. Through memory, Atlantis continues to influence thought and art. It shapes how people imagine the past and question the present. It encourages humility by reminding listeners that achievement does not guarantee endurance. It invites care by suggesting that balance once lost may not be restored. In quiet listening, especially in moments of rest, the story takes on a different texture. Without urgency, it becomes meditative. The mind drifts alongside the narrative, absorbing its rhythm rather than its argument. Atlantis becomes less a subject to analyze and more a landscape to move through slowly. This is perhaps how the story was always meant to be experienced, not as a problem to solve, but as a space to inhabit, a place where thought can wander without needing to arrive. In this way, Atlantis functions like the ocean itself, vast, reflective, and endlessly suggestive. As the hours pass and the story continues, Atlantis remains unchanged in its essence, an island beyond reach, a civilization remembered through fragments, a silence beneath waves. It does not ask to be believed or dismissed. It asks only to be carried forward gently, as people have done for thousands of years. And so the story flows on, steady and unhurried, like deep water moving beneath the surface of time. Atlantis drifts with it, neither fully present nor fully gone, suspended in the quiet space where imagination and memory meet. As the hours of listening stretch on, the story of Atlantis begins to feel less like something being told and more like something being remembered. The language softens. The images blur slightly at the edges. What remains is not a sequence of facts, but a mood, a sense of distance, a feeling of something once held and now released. In this way, Atlantis resembles memory itself. Human memory does not preserve events as they were. It reshapes them, smooths some details, deepens others, and slowly weaves them into identity. Atlantis may be one of humanity's oldest shared memories, not of a specific place, but of impermanence, of the moment when stability gives way and the world changes beyond recognition. When Plato wrote of Atlantis, he placed it deliberately outside recorded Greek history. It existed before the age of heroes, before the wars and genealogies that structured myth. By doing so, he positioned Atlantis in a time that could not be verified, only contemplated. This choice allowed the story to function on a deeper level, one where emotional truth mattered more than chronology. That emotional truth centers on balance. Atlantis began in harmony between human and divine, land and sea, wealth and restraint. Its fall was not caused by ignorance, but by forgetting. Forgetting limits, forgetting humility, forgetting that power requires care. This theme does not age. It renews itself in every era where success creates the illusion of permanence. Listening quietly, it becomes easier to notice how gently the story carries this lesson. There is no dramatic condemnation, no thunderous judgment. The destruction arrives almost calmly, as if nature simply corrected an imbalance. Earthquakes, floods, silence. The absence of drama makes the ending more unsettling and more believable. In many modern retellings, Atlantis is imagined as technologically advanced beyond anything known in antiquity. While this idea goes far beyond Plato, it reflects a modern preoccupation. The fear that technology might advance faster than wisdom, that systems might grow so complex they cannot be controlled. In this light, Atlantis becomes a projection of contemporary unease rather than ancient history. Yet even stripped of advanced machines and crystals, the original story remains powerful. Its true technology was organization, engineering, governance, trade. These were the achievements Plato emphasized, and they were impressive by any standard. Atlantis did not fall because it lacked knowledge, but because knowledge alone was not enough. This distinction matters. It suggests that progress without reflection is fragile, that intelligence without ethics is unstable. Atlantis did not fail intellectually, it failed morally. Or perhaps more accurately, it failed to notice when its values began to shift. This kind of failure is quiet, gradual, and easy to miss until it is too late. If this long journey through the story of Atlantis has felt calming or thought-provoking, you might gently like the video or subscribe to the channel. It helps keep these extended, peaceful documentaries available for those who enjoy listening at their own pace. As the narrative continues to unfold, Atlantis feels less like a warning shouted from the past and more like a whisper carried alongside the present. It does not demand urgency. It invites awareness. The awareness that civilizations are living systems, dependent on balance and care. The awareness that nature is not an opponent to conquer, but a force to live within. In sleep-friendly listening, these ideas settle differently. They drift rather than press. The listener does not need to analyze or judge. The story simply flows, offering images and patterns that the mind can follow or let go of. Atlantis becomes a place the mind can rest, paradoxically, because its story is already complete. There is no suspense about what happens next. The ending is known. And in that certainty, there is a strange comfort. The mind is free from anticipation. It can move slowly through the imagery, the rings of water, the central temple, the wide plains, and finally the sea closing over it all. This repetition is not redundant. It is meditative. Like waves returning to shore, the same elements appear again and again, each time slightly changed by context. This rhythm aligns the story with natural cycles, reinforcing the sense that Atlantis is less an anomaly and more an expression of how the world works. In the deepest sense, Atlantis may be a story about listening, listening to warnings, listening to the environment, listening to the quiet signals of imbalance before they become catastrophe. The tragedy of Atlantis is not that it was destroyed, but that it did not listen in time. And yet, humanity listens now, through the story itself, through its endurance, through the way it continues to surface when people pause and reflect. Atlantis may be gone, but its echo remains active, shaping thought long after stone and metal have vanished. As the narration moves forward, it carries this echo gently, without urgency or insistence. Atlantis does not need to be solved. It needs to be remembered, not as a map location, but as a shared reflection on what it means to build, to flourish, and to lose. The sea, ever patient, holds the final image. Not destruction, but stillness. Light filtering down, shapes dissolving, time passing without witness. And somewhere above, people telling the story again, softly, ensuring that what was lost is not forgotten, even if it can never be recovered. As the story continues to unfold in this unhurried way, Atlantis settles fully into the realm of timeless narrative. It no longer belongs to any single culture, philosopher, or century. It belongs to the long human habit of looking backward in order to understand the present. In this role, Atlantis is less a mystery to be solved and more a companion to thought, appearing when reflection deepens and certainty softens. There is something uniquely human about preserving a story that offers no rescue and no return. Atlantis does not promise survival or renewal. It simply ends, and yet that ending has not discouraged its retelling. Instead, it has made the story resilient. It asks nothing from the listener except attention. It does not try to persuade. It does not demand belief. It remains open, allowing each listener to find their own meaning within its slow currents. In quiet moments, especially when the mind drifts toward rest, the imagery of Atlantis becomes almost abstract. The rings of land and water are no longer architectural features, but symbols of order. The central island becomes a still point. The surrounding sea becomes time itself, endlessly moving, endlessly erasing. In this abstraction, the story becomes less about a civilization and more about existence. Plato's choice to place Atlantis beyond the edge of the known world was not accidental. To the ancient Greeks, the ocean marked the boundary between the familiar and the unknowable. Beyond it lay not just foreign lands, but uncertainty itself. By situating Atlantis there, Plato gave physical form to the idea of limits. Some knowledge lies beyond reach. Some histories cannot be recovered. Some losses must be accepted. This acceptance is a quiet theme running beneath the entire narrative. Atlantis is not framed as a tragedy that could have been prevented through heroism or sacrifice. It is framed as a consequence of imbalance, followed by disappearance. The absence of struggle at the end is striking. There is no final stand, no desperate attempt to save the city. The world shifts, and Atlantis is simply no longer there. This absence of drama changes how the story is absorbed. It does not provoke excitement. It invites stillness. The listener is not pulled forward by tension, but gently carried along by rhythm. This quality makes Atlantis especially suited to long-form listening, where the goal is not resolution, but immersion. As time moves on, it becomes clear that Atlantis survives because it adapts without losing its core. It can be read as history, allegory, psychology, environmental warning, or philosophical meditation. Each reading reveals something different, yet none cancel the others out. This flexibility allows the story to remain relevant without being fixed. In the modern imagination, Atlantis often reflects concerns about scale. Societies today are vast, interconnected, and powerful in ways that would have been unimaginable in antiquity. Yet this scale brings vulnerability. A single disruption can ripple outward, affecting millions. In this context, the image of an entire civilization disappearing in a short span feels less fantastical than it once did. Still, the story does not linger on fear. It does not dwell on suffering. It remains distant, almost serene. This emotional distance allows reflection without distress. Atlantis becomes a safe place to explore difficult ideas. Collapse, loss, impermanence. These are faced indirectly through story rather than experience. The longer one listens, the more Atlantis seems to dissolve into a feeling rather than a narrative, a sense of deep time, a reminder that human history is brief compared to the forces that shape the earth. Mountains rise and fall, seas advance and retreat, civilizations appear and vanish. The story aligns human experience with these larger rhythms, reducing urgency and restoring perspective. In this perspective, the disappearance of Atlantis is not an anomaly. It is part of a pattern that has repeated many times and will repeat again. What changes is not the pattern, but the scale and the form. The lesson remains consistent. Balance matters. Awareness matters. Memory matters. Atlantis, remembered through centuries, becomes an anchor for these ideas. It is not tied to a single moral or instruction. It simply exists as a reminder. A reminder that even the most impressive structures are temporary, that even the most carefully planned systems can fail, that the world does not pause for human ambition. And yet, there is no bitterness in this reminder. The story does not diminish human creativity or effort. Atlantis is described as beautiful, ingenious, and impressive. Its loss does not negate its existence. Instead, it highlights the value of what was achieved, even if it could not last. In this way, Atlantis honors creation without promising permanence. It allows appreciation without attachment. This balance mirrors the rhythm of nature itself, where growth and decay are intertwined. Nothing is meant to remain unchanged. Everything leaves traces, whether physical or remembered. As the narration continues, these ideas drift quietly, without insistence. The listener does not need to agree or disagree. The story simply unfolds, offering space rather than conclusions. Atlantis becomes less a subject of thought and more a background presence, like distant waves or a fading horizon. Eventually, the details of the story may fade, but the feeling remains. A calm awareness of time, a softened understanding of loss, a gentle acceptance of change. These are the gifts Atlantis offers, not through answers, but through atmosphere. And so the story continues, unhurried and unbroken. Atlantis remains beneath the surface, not hidden in darkness, but resting in stillness. It does not wait to be discovered. It waits to be remembered, quietly, as the listener drifts onward, carried by the steady movement of words and the deeper current beneath them. As the narrative drifts onward, Atlantis becomes almost indistinguishable from the passage of time itself. It no longer feels anchored to a beginning or an end, but exists in a continuous present, always just beyond reach. This quality gives the story a soothing depth. There is nothing to resolve, nothing to chase, only a gentle unfolding, like water moving over stone. What makes Atlantis so enduring is not the drama of its destruction, but the restraint with which that destruction is described. Plato did not linger on suffering. He did not catalogue panic or despair. He allowed the event to pass quickly, almost respectfully. This restraint leaves space for the listener's imagination, which often fills silence more powerfully than detail ever could. In that silence, Atlantis becomes personal. Each listener brings their own associations to the story. For some, it is a memory of places changed beyond recognition. For others, it is a reflection on moments when balance was lost quietly, without warning. The story does not impose meaning, it absorbs it. As the world has grown more interconnected, the idea of sudden, widespread change has become easier to imagine. Systems once thought stable are now understood to be fragile. Supply chains, climates, ecosystems, and cultures are all deeply linked. A disturbance in one place can echo far beyond its origin. In this light, Atlantis feels less like an ancient exaggeration and more like an early intuition of complexity. Yet the story remains calm. It does not escalate to urgency. It does not urge action. Its power lies in observation rather than instruction. Atlantis does not tell humanity what to do, it shows what happens. The listener is free to draw conclusions or simply rest within the narrative. This calmness is essential to its role as sleep-friendly listening. There are no sharp turns, no sudden revelations. The mind can follow the flow or drift away from it without losing coherence. The story repeats its themes gently, reinforcing rather than demanding attention. Loss, balance, memory, time. If you find this steady rhythm comforting, you might quietly like the video or subscribe to the channel. It helps ensure these long, unhurried stories remain available for those who enjoy listening at their own pace. As the hours pass, Atlantis feels increasingly abstract. It is no longer necessary to visualize its walls or temples. The idea alone is enough. A civilization rising, a civilization falling, water closing over what once was solid. This simplicity is part of the story's strength. It can be carried easily without effort. In many ways, Atlantis functions like a shared dream. Dreams often blend memory and imagination, compressing time and space into symbolic images. They are rarely precise, yet they feel meaningful. Atlantis shares this quality. It does not need clarity to resonate. Its vagueness allows it to slip past analysis and settle into feeling. The sea, once again, plays a central role in this dreamlike quality. Water blurs boundaries. It distorts perception. It reflects and conceals at the same time. By ending Atlantis beneath the sea, the story ensures that it will never be fully visible, only suggested. This suggestion keeps it alive. As centuries pass within the story, even the idea of searching for Atlantis begins to feel secondary. Whether or not it is ever found matters less than the fact that people continue to look. The search itself becomes a form of storytelling, a way of engaging with the past and questioning the present. In this sense, Atlantis is not a lost place, but an ongoing process. It evolves as understanding evolves. It absorbs new knowledge and sheds outdated assumptions, yet its core remains untouched. A reminder that greatness is fleeting, that memory is selective, that time is vast. The longer one listens, the more Atlantis resembles a horizon rather than an object. It gives orientation without offering arrival. It suggests direction without destination. This quality allows the mind to relax. There is no need to reach the end. The story is not going anywhere. It simply continues, and perhaps that is the quiet lesson embedded within it. That meaning does not always come from resolution. Sometimes it comes from presence, from sitting with an idea long enough that it softens and integrates rather than demanding explanation. Atlantis offers that kind of presence. It does not intrude, it accompanies. It moves alongside the listener, steady and patient. Its waters are deep but calm. Its silence is not empty but full of implication. As the narration flows on, Atlantis remains where it has always been, beyond certainty, beneath the surface. Not waiting to be raised, but content to remain submerged, shaping thought through absence rather than form. And so the story continues, without urgency and without end, carried forward by voices, memories, and the quiet human need to understand how things begin, how they flourish, and how they fade, leaving behind not ruins, but echoes. As the listening continues, Atlantis becomes less distinct as a story and more like a landscape the mind moves through slowly. It no longer matters where the island might have been or whether it existed in stone and soil. What matters is the atmosphere it creates, a sense of depth, a sense of distance, a feeling of time stretching far beyond individual lives. In this state, Atlantis feels closer to nature than to history, like mountains worn smooth by wind or coastlines reshaped by tides. It represents change that happens whether or not anyone is watching. The story does not hinge on human intention. It unfolds according to forces larger than ambition or desire. This perspective gently reduces the weight of individual concerns, placing them within a wider rhythm. Plato's Atlantis was described with care and symmetry, yet its end was sudden and absolute. This contrast mirrors a truth found throughout the natural world. Complexity does not guarantee resilience. In fact, it often increases vulnerability. The more intricate a system becomes, the more ways it can fail. Atlantis embodies this paradox without stating it outright. Listening quietly, this idea does not feel alarming. It feels clarifying. The story does not suggest that building or striving is wrong. It suggests that awareness must grow alongside capability. When it does not, imbalance emerges quietly, long before collapse becomes visible. The absence of survivors in the Atlantis story is striking. There are no voices from the ruins, no descendants carrying forward a direct memory. Atlantis ends completely, leaving only second-hand accounts and philosophical reflection. This silence gives the story a unique weight. It does not argue for preservation. It accepts erasure. And yet, erasure is never complete. Even when places disappear, they leave impressions. They shape language, values, and imagination. Atlantis survives not because it was recorded in detail, but because it was remembered with intention. The act of remembering becomes more important than what is remembered exactly. This is why Atlantis can be revisited endlessly without losing its quiet power. Each return is slightly different. The listener is different. The world is different. New concerns color old images. The story adapts without resistance, offering reflection rather than instruction. In extended listening, repetition becomes a comfort rather than a flaw. The same themes appear again and again, gently reinforcing themselves. Balance and excess, creation and loss, memory and forgetting. These are not problems to solve, but patterns to recognize. Their repetition mirrors the way nature itself repeats without boredom. As the mind relaxes, the boundaries between listening and imagining begin to soften. The story becomes a background current. Words drift in and out of focus. Images appear briefly, then dissolve. Atlantis no longer needs to be followed closely. It can simply be present. This quality is what allows the story to accompany rest. There are no sharp turns that demand attention, no unresolved conflicts that create tension. The ending is known and therefore soothing. The mind does not brace for surprise. It floats. In this floating state, Atlantis feels less like a cautionary tale and more like a reminder of scale. Human history occupies a thin layer atop much deeper time. Beneath it lie ages shaped by ice, fire, and water. Civilizations rise and fall within this layer, briefly altering the surface before being absorbed again. Atlantis fits naturally into this view. It is one of many moments when human order met natural force and yielded. Its distinction lies not in its uniqueness, but in the clarity with which that meeting is remembered. The sea remains the final image, steady and indifferent. It does not celebrate destruction, nor does it mourn. It simply moves. This neutrality is part of the story's calm. It removes blame and drama, leaving only consequence. As the narration flows on, there is no need to reach a conclusion. Atlantis does not resolve into certainty. It dissolves into understanding that is felt rather than articulated. A quiet acceptance that all things pass, and that meaning can exist without permanence. The story continues because people continue to listen, not for answers, but for atmosphere, not for proof, but for perspective. Atlantis offers a wide, quiet space where thought can slow and rest. In that space, the island remains submerged, unchanged by speculation or doubt. It does not rise closer as listening deepens. It does not fade away either. It simply remains, like a distant shape beneath clear water, visible enough to suggest form, distant enough to remain untouchable. And so the narration carries on, steady and patient. Atlantis moves with it, neither beginning nor ending, existing in the long middle where stories live longest, where meaning is not fixed, but gently carried forward, one listener at a time. As the hours pass within the story, Atlantis feels less like something separate from the listener and more like something quietly shared. It becomes part of the listening experience itself, woven into the slow rhythm of breath and thought. The island no longer needs to be imagined clearly. Its presence is suggested rather than seen, felt rather than defined. This gentle indistinctness is part of what makes the story restful. Clear edges demand attention. Soft edges allow the mind to wander. Atlantis offers those soft edges. Its outlines blur naturally, like objects viewed through water. This blurring does not weaken the story. It deepens it, allowing multiple meanings to exist at once without conflict. In this softened state, Atlantis begins to resemble a memory that does not belong to any single person. It feels inherited rather than learned. A shared recollection passed down not through facts, but through feeling. Loss without trauma. Grandeur without pride. Silence without fear. Many ancient cultures believed that memory itself shaped reality. To remember something was to keep it alive in some essential way. In this sense, Atlantis has never truly disappeared. It continues to exist as long as it is remembered, retold, and reimagined. Its survival is not physical, but cultural. The longer one listens, the more this idea settles. That permanence does not require stone. That endurance does not depend on structures or monuments. Stories can last longer than cities. Meanings can outlive materials. Atlantis demonstrates this quietly, simply by continuing to be told. If this calm, extended journey has been meaningful or comforting for you, you might gently leave a comment or share the video with someone who enjoys long, reflective listening. Small acts like that help these stories continue their slow passage through time. In the stillness of the narrative, Atlantis also reveals something about human patience. Modern life often moves quickly, driven by urgency and outcome. Atlantis resists this pace. It unfolds slowly, without reward or resolution. It asks the listener to stay without expecting something to happen. This can feel unfamiliar at first, then deeply settling. The absence of urgency creates space for subtle thought. Ideas surface and sink again without pressure. The mind is free to observe rather than react. Atlantis becomes less a lesson and more an environment, a mental place shaped by calm repetition and gentle imagery. The sea remains central to this environment. It is both the setting and the storyteller. Water carries memory differently than land. It erases detail while preserving outline. It smooths sharp edges, leaving only what endures. By placing Atlantis beneath the sea, the story ensures that only its most essential elements remain. Those elements are simple: a beginning shaped by harmony, a middle shaped by excess, an end shaped by consequence. This simplicity allows the story to be carried easily without strain. It does not overwhelm. It does not demand interpretation. It offers pattern. Patterns are comforting to the human mind. They suggest order even when the subject is loss. Atlantis offers order without control. It shows that even collapse follows a rhythm, a logic shaped by cause and effect. This understanding does not remove sadness, but it reduces fear. In the deepest layers of listening, Atlantis may no longer feel like a warning at all. It may feel like acceptance. Acceptance that change is inevitable, that no structure lasts forever, that memory itself is a kind of survival. As the narration continues, words become less important than cadence. The steady flow carries the listener forward, whether attention is focused or drifting. Atlantis remains present either way. It does not require concentration to exist. It is content to accompany. This is how the story has endured across centuries. not by insisting, but by remaining available, ready to be entered when the world grows loud or when the mind seeks quiet. Atlantis waits not in the past, but in the space created by listening. And so the journey continues, unbroken and unhurried. The island remains beneath the surface, unchanged by time, not because it resists time, but because it belongs to it. Atlantis does not stand outside history. It flows within it, like a deep current that never reaches the shore, yet subtly shapes it all the same. As the narrative continues in this slow and steady way, Atlantis becomes almost inseparable from the act of listening itself. It no longer feels like a subject being explored, but like a presence accompanying the listener through time. The island rests beneath the words, beneath thought, beneath effort, asking for nothing more than attention that can drift freely. In this state, the story functions less as information and more as atmosphere. The details no longer matter in the way they once did. The names, the places, even the sequence of events soften and recede. What remains is the underlying movement. Rise, balance, drift, fall, stillness. These motions echo the natural rhythms of breathing and rest. Atlantis becomes a kind of mental shoreline, a place where the mind can pause without expectation. There is no mystery to solve, no revelation approaching. The end has already happened, and because of that, the story carries no tension. It exists entirely in reflection, which allows the listener to remain present without anticipation. This quality separates Atlantis from many other ancient stories. There are no heroes to follow, no battles to track, no victories to celebrate. The focus is broad and distant. A civilization as a whole rises and disappears. Individuals are unnamed and indistinct. This distance makes the story feel universal rather than personal, and in that universality, it becomes easier to rest within it. The ocean continues to hold the center of the narrative. It is not portrayed as violent or cruel, but as inevitable. Water rises, land recedes, shapes blur, time moves forward. There is no malice in this movement, only process. Atlantis does not fall because the sea is angry. It falls because conditions change. Listening to this, the mind may begin to mirror the same acceptance. Thoughts rise and fade without needing to be held. Attention drifts and returns without effort. The story does not punish distraction, it welcomes it. Atlantis does not disappear when the listener looks away. It remains quietly present. Over long stretches of listening, the story may begin to feel circular. Similar ideas return again and again, slightly altered by context. This repetition is not meant to progress the narrative, but to deepen familiarity. Like waves repeating their motion, the value lies not in novelty, but in consistency. In this consistency, Atlantis becomes dependable. The listener knows what kind of story this is. There will be no sudden shifts, no sharp edges. The tone remains calm. The pace remains unhurried. The imagery remains soft. This predictability is not dull, it is grounding. As time passes, the distinction between past and present grows less important. Atlantis does not feel ancient in the usual sense. It feels timeless. Its story could belong to any era where humans built, believed, and eventually faced change. This timelessness allows the listener to place their own moment gently alongside the story without conflict. The island beneath the sea becomes a symbol not of what was lost, but of what always passes. Civilizations, moments, emotions, even thoughts themselves. Everything arises, holds for a while, and then dissolves. Atlantis simply gives this process a shape that can be remembered. There is no urgency in this realization. It does not call for action or regret. It encourages ease. An understanding that effort and impermanence can coexist. That meaning does not require endurance. That beauty does not need to last forever to matter. As the narration continues, it becomes less about telling and more about accompanying. The words guide gently, but they do not lead toward a destination. Atlantis remains where it has always been, beneath the surface, beyond certainty, steady in its quietness. The listener is free to remain fully awake or to drift toward rest. The story does not change its pace in response. It flows on, constant and patient. Atlantis does not demand to be held in focus. It is content to exist at the edges of awareness, and so the journey carries on, without pressure and without end. The island stays submerged, not hidden, but resting. The sea above it moves gently. Time continues its long arc, and the story remains, flowing softly, offering a calm place for the mind to settle whenever it returns. As the story moves forward, Atlantis feels almost weightless, like a thought that no longer belongs to any single moment. It drifts freely, untethered from chronology, carried by repetition and familiarity. The listener does not need to remember what came before, because the story is always returning to the same quiet center. In this state, Atlantis becomes less a narrative and more a rhythm. A slow, even cadence that mirrors natural cycles, day into night, tide moving in and out, thought rising and settling again. The island exists within this rhythm, never fully appearing, never fully disappearing. What remains striking is how little effort the story requires. It does not ask the listener to hold onto details or track progress. It does not reward attention with resolution. Instead, it offers a steady presence. Atlantis becomes something to rest beside rather than examine. This quality may reflect the way ancient people related to stories. They were not consumed quickly or analyzed intensely. They were lived with, told again and again, not to extract new meaning, but to reaffirm familiar patterns. Atlantis fits naturally into this tradition, offering reassurance through repetition. The repetition itself is gentle. The same ideas return without insistence: balance and excess, creation and loss, memory and forgetting. Each time they appear, they feel slightly softer, less demanding. Over time, they blend into a single impression rather than separate thoughts. If this long, unbroken flow has felt comforting, you might quietly like the video or subscribe to the channel. It helps these extended, calm documentaries continue for those who enjoy listening slowly and without pressure. As the listener settles deeper into the rhythm, Atlantis feels less symbolic and more elemental. It is water and stone, time and silence. It does not speak loudly. It does not argue. It simply exists, offering a sense of scale that places individual concerns gently into perspective. The sea remains unchanged in its role. It is not an ending, but a continuation. It does not erase meaning. It transforms it. What was once solid becomes fluid. What was once visible becomes felt. Atlantis survives in this transformation, not as a place, but as a presence. In long listening, this transformation mirrors the movement of the mind toward rest. Thoughts lose their sharpness. Boundaries soften. Attention widens. The story does not interrupt this process. It supports it, moving alongside without resistance. Atlantis does not insist on being understood. It allows misunderstanding. It allows ambiguity. These are not flaws in the story. They are essential to its endurance. A story that explains everything leaves no space. Atlantis leaves space everywhere. As time passes within the narration, the listener may no longer be consciously following the words. They may drift in and out, catching fragments, then releasing them. The story remains intact regardless. Atlantis does not depend on constant attention. It remains present even when unheard. This is how the island has lasted across centuries, not by demanding focus, but by remaining available, ready to be returned to whenever the world grows loud or the mind seeks quiet. Atlantis waits without expectation. The deeper one listens, the more the story feels complete without ever concluding. There is no final statement to reach, no summary to arrive at. The ending has always been known, and yet the story continues because meaning does not require novelty. Atlantis becomes a reminder that some things are not meant to be resolved. They are meant to be revisited. Each return deepens familiarity rather than knowledge. This familiarity brings calm. As the narration flows on, the island remains beneath the surface, unchanged and unchanging. It does not rise closer with time. It does not fade away either. It simply remains, a steady presence within the long movement of thought and listening. And so the journey continues, quietly and patiently. Atlantis drifts alongside the listener, neither destination nor departure, but a gentle constant in the background. A story that does not end, because it does not need to. As the narration carries on, Atlantis becomes almost transparent, like a layer of calm laid gently over the flow of time. The story no longer feels as though it is moving forward or backward. It simply exists, steady and unchanging, allowing the listener to settle into it without effort. At this stage, Atlantis feels less like a subject and more like a state of mind. It holds space rather than content. The familiar elements remain present, the sea, the island, the silence, but they no longer ask to be visualized clearly. They function as anchors, giving shape to stillness rather than demanding attention. This quality reflects something essential about how humans process long narratives. Over time, the mind stops focusing on individual details and begins to absorb tone and rhythm instead. Meaning shifts from information to atmosphere. Atlantis adapts naturally to this shift, becoming quieter as listening deepens. In this quiet, the story reveals another layer. Atlantis is not only about loss, but about continuity. Even as the island disappears, the telling continues. Even as form dissolves, pattern remains. This suggests that while structures fall, processes endure. Memory flows forward, reshaping itself without breaking. The sea once again becomes the most important presence. It is vast, patient, and neutral. It does not judge the civilization it covers. It does not preserve or destroy with intention. It simply moves. This neutrality gives the story its calm. There is no villain, no blame, only change. Listening to this, the mind may find reassurance, not because the story promises safety, but because it normalizes impermanence. Nothing is singled out for destruction. Everything participates in the same cycle. Atlantis is not an exception. It is an example. As the rhythm continues, the listener may notice that the story does not require memory. If parts are missed, nothing is lost. If attention drifts, the story does not punish the absence. This makes it easy to remain with the narration for long stretches, allowing it to fade in and out of focus. In this way, Atlantis becomes companionable. It does not compete with thought or rest. It accompanies both. The words move steadily, providing a soft structure that supports rather than directs. Over time, even the idea of Atlantis as a place may fall away. What remains is a feeling of depth, of something existing beneath the surface of awareness. This mirrors the way the unconscious mind holds experiences quietly, influencing without announcing itself. Plato's original account survives within this feeling, even when its details are no longer foregrounded. The rise, the balance, the excess, the fall. These stages echo faintly, like a pattern traced again and again, until it becomes familiar enough to fade. This fading is not disappearance, it is integration. The story becomes part of the listening itself, indistinguishable from the calm it produces. Atlantis does not stand apart from the experience. It becomes the experience. As the narration continues, there is no need to reach a conclusion. The ending has already passed, and the story exists beyond it. The sea has closed. Silence has settled. And still, the telling goes on, because memory moves forward even when events do not. In this extended stillness, Atlantis offers something rare, a narrative without demand, a story that does not seek reaction. It allows the listener to be exactly where they are, awake or drifting, attentive or unfocused. The island remains submerged, unchanged by speculation, untouched by certainty. It does not emerge as clarity increases, nor does it fade as attention softens. It stays where it has always been, in the quiet space beneath awareness. And so the story continues, gentle and unbroken. Atlantis flows alongside the listener, not as something to grasp, but as something to move with. A steady presence within time, carrying forward the simple understanding that all things rise, all things pass, and some stories remain, not because they are solved, but because they are allowed to be. As this long passage of listening approaches a natural resting point, Atlantis remains exactly as it has always been within the story. It does not move closer, and it does not recede. It rests beneath the surface of awareness, steady and unchanged, held not by certainty, but by familiarity. There is a quiet completeness to this moment, not because everything has been explained, but because nothing needs to be. Atlantis has unfolded as far as it can, not into answers, but into atmosphere. The rise and fall have already happened. What remains is the echo, moving gently through time and thought. In this echo, the story no longer feels like history or myth. It feels like something elemental, like the sound of waves heard from a distance, constant enough to fade into the background, present enough to be reassuring. Atlantis becomes part of that background, a steady presence rather than a focal point. The mind, having traveled this far with the narration, no longer needs direction. The words can continue, or they can slowly fall away. Either way, the story holds. It does not unravel when attention loosens. It does not disappear when silence grows. Atlantis remains intact precisely because it is not dependent on effort. This is perhaps the final gift of the story. It teaches that meaning does not require control, that understanding does not always arrive through clarity. Sometimes it arrives through repetition, through stillness, through simply remaining with an idea long enough for it to soften. Atlantis does not resolve into a lesson written plainly. Instead, it settles into a quiet awareness. That balance matters. That excess carries consequence. That loss is part of continuity. These ideas do not announce themselves. They rest beneath the surface, available when needed. As the listening slows, Atlantis feels less like something remembered and more like something carried. It moves forward not as information, but as tone. A calm, reflective presence that can return whenever the world grows loud or the mind seeks rest. The sea, as always, remains the final image, not violent, not dramatic, just wide, patient, and enduring. Beneath it, the island rests. Above it, time continues. Stories are told. Lives unfold. And somewhere between these layers, Atlantis persists, unchanged by belief or doubt. If this long, unhurried journey through the story of Atlantis has brought you calm or reflection, you might gently like the video, subscribe to the channel, or share it with someone who enjoys slow, immersive listening. Small gestures like that help keep these quiet stories flowing. There is no need to say goodbye to Atlantis. It does not end. It simply becomes quiet again, returning to the background where it has always belonged. The listener can carry it forward without effort, letting it surface only when the moment feels right. And so the narration eases naturally into stillness. The words grow lighter. The imagery softens. Atlantis remains beneath the surface, resting within time, content to be remembered not as a place to be found, but as a story that never needed to be finished. The story continues quietly beyond any clear ending, because Atlantis has never belonged to endings. It belongs to the long spaces between beginnings and conclusions, where thought slows and certainty loosens. Even now, nothing new needs to be added for the story to remain alive. Its presence is sustained by attention that does not grasp, by listening that does not demand. In this final stretch of narration, Atlantis feels fully absorbed into the listener's inner landscape. It no longer stands apart as an island, a civilization, or a mystery. It has become a calm undercurrent, something sensed rather than described. The sea, the silence, the passage of time all blend into a single impression of continuity. There is a gentle acceptance here. The understanding that some stories are not meant to be resolved or completed in a traditional sense. They exist to accompany, to offer perspective, to remind without insisting. Atlantis has done this simply by remaining present across centuries, changing form while holding essence. The rise of the island, its balance, its excess, and its disappearance no longer feel like events. They feel like motions that repeat everywhere, in nature, in societies, in individual lives: growth, stability, drift, release. Seen this way, Atlantis is not exceptional, it is representative. And that is what gives it lasting meaning. As the narration continues, words themselves become less important than the space between them. The pauses, the steady pace, the absence of urgency. Atlantis rests comfortably in that space, where nothing needs to be proven and nothing needs to be remembered exactly. The listener does not leave Atlantis behind at this point, nor does Atlantis come forward. The relationship simply loosens, allowing the story to settle wherever it naturally belongs, in memory, in feeling, in quiet reflection. Time keeps moving as it always has. Seas rise and fall, landscapes change, civilizations build and dissolve. Stories remain not as fixed records, but as living currents. Atlantis is one of those currents, deep and slow, shaping thought gently without ever forcing it. And so the narration does not end so much as it fades into the same stillness from which the story first emerged. Atlantis remains beneath the surface, unchanged, untroubled, content to exist without explanation.